The year is 399 BC. Athens, a prison cell. The afternoon light is already fading when Crito, gray-bearded and desperate, slips past the guards. His hands are full, money, documents, a plan. His best friend sits on a wooden bench, chains loose around his ankles. Socrates has been offered a way out, a real escape route. Wealthy allies have paid off the guards. No one would know, no one would judge him. He could walk free tonight and disappear into exile. But Socrates will not go. This refusal, this one act of stubborn principle, will become immortal. But what if we told you that the trial leading to this moment was never really about what Athens claimed? That the charges of impiety and corrupting youth were a mask? That the real story is one of betrayal, layered, complex, and far more dangerous than any religious scandal? We're about to investigate the trial that changed Western philosophy. But first, you need to know who betrayed whom. Welcome to Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, the podcast where history becomes personal. I'm your host, and we're diving into one of ancient history's most celebrated and misunderstood moments, the trial and death of Socrates, 70 years old, accused of impiety and corruption, and executed despite his claims of innocence. But here's what your history book probably didn't mention. Many scholars argue the trial had significant political dimensions beyond the stated religious charges. It was about power, fear, and a democracy so fragile it felt threatened by a philosopher. Today, we're answering this question. In a city that invented democracy, how did the man who taught people to question everything become too dangerous to live? It's spring, 399 BC, the city of Athens. Picture it, marble colonnades, olive groves, the Parthenon glowing on the Acropolis. But beneath the beauty, there's panic, real, palpable panic. Just 5 years earlier, Athens had been at war with Sparta for nearly 3 decades, the Peloponnesian War. It had drained the treasury, filled the graveyards, and, most importantly for our story, broken something in the Athenian mind, their confidence, their sense that they were untouchable. In 404 BC, Athens lost, completely. The Spartans besieged the city, cut off supplies, and demanded surrender. And as part of that surrender, Sparta didn't just impose economic terms, it imposed an entirely new government. A council of 30 pro-Spartan oligarchs replaced Athens' beloved democracy. What happened next was, by most accounts, a reign of terror. According to later ancient sources, the 30 executed around 1,500 Athenians. Not in public trials, not with any pretense of justice. They simply decided you were a problem, because you were wealthy, because you were vocal, because you looked at them the wrong way. And you were dead. One of their targets was a man named Theramenes, who had been their own ally until he objected to the killing. Critias, the most brutal of the 30, forced him to drink hemlock. Yes, the same poison that killed Socrates. That's not coincidence. That's part of our story. By 403 BC, Athens had had enough. A resistance campaign, led by a general named Thrasybulus, drove the 30 from power. Democracy was restored, and Athens did something almost unprecedented. They declared a general amnesty. Anyone who had supported the oligarchs couldn't be prosecuted. The goal was reconciliation, to prevent civil war. But here's the problem. Socrates was still in Athens, and Socrates had connections to the 30. The worst connection? Critias himself. Critias, who had been a student of Socrates who sat at his feet learning about virtue and justice, had become the architect of mass execution. And everyone knew it. Everyone knew that this student of Socrates had become a tyrant. There was also Alcibiades, another student, another connection, another scandal. Alcibiades had been a young aristocrat with extraordinary charisma, brilliant military strategist, politically ambitious, and he had betrayed Athens. In 415 BC, just before a major military expedition to Sicily, Alcibiades had allegedly mutilated statues of the god Hermes. He fled to Sparta, then he negotiated with Persia. He was a serial defector, a man who had played multiple sides of the Peloponnesian War for his own gain. And Athens had not forgotten. So, in 399 BC, 4 years after democracy returned, Socrates is still teaching. He's around 70 years old. He still walks through the agora, the marketplace, surrounded by young men, still asking questions, still making people uncomfortable, still questioning authority. And a poet named Miletus decides he's had enough. Miletus files a legal accusation, a graphe asabius as it was called, against Socrates. The official charges recorded by his student Plato. Socrates does not acknowledge the gods that the city acknowledges. He introduces new divinities, and he corrupts the youth of Athens. These charges go to trial before a jury of 501 male Athenian citizens, chosen by lot. The trial happens on a single day, likely in late spring. Socrates defends himself. Plato tells us he spoke with directness, almost with contempt for his judges. He claimed he'd never intentionally corrupted anyone. He attacked his accuser's logic. And he made a statement that may have sealed his fate. He suggested that instead of execution, Athens should give him free food for the rest of his life because of the service he'd provided to the city. The jury did not appreciate this. The vote was close, but not close enough. 280 citizens voted guilty, 221 voted not guilty. A majority of nearly 60 jurors decided that Socrates posed a threat that had to be removed. Socrates was sentenced to death. The method? Hemlock poison. The time? After a religious festival a few weeks away. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Everything we know about Socrates comes from his students, mostly from Plato, who was there, who loved him, and who wrote about him long after he was dead. We also have accounts from Xenophon, a military historian who was also a student of Socrates, and we have a brief mention from Aristophanes, a comic playwright who made fun of Socrates in a play called The Clouds, produced in 423 BC, 24 years before the trial. Scholars call this the Socratic problem. We have contradictory accounts written after the fact by people with emotional investments in defending Socrates. Plato's Socrates is witty, ironic, almost godlike in his wisdom. Xenophon's Socrates is duller, more practical, less interested in philosophy, and more interested in self-control. Were these different men described by different observers, or was one author closer to the truth? For our investigation, we're going to treat these accounts as the best evidence we have, but with eyes open to their biases. There are primary sources, there are witnesses, and like all witnesses, they see what they want to see. What's certain, Socrates was tried, Socrates was convicted, and Socrates died. But the question that will unravel everything is this: was he tried for impiety, or was he tried for something far more political? This chapter answers, how did Socrates' most brilliant students become evidence against him? Let's start with Alcibiades, because Alcibiades is the scandal that never goes away. Imagine you're Athenian in 399 BC. You're sitting in a marketplace. You hear the news, Socrates is being tried. And your mind immediately goes back, not just a few years, but nearly 20 years, to 415 BC, to one of the greatest disasters in Athenian history. Alcibiades was Socrates' most famous student, handsome, rich, connected. According to later writers, so beautiful that people compared him to the mythic hero Achilles. He was also politically ambitious in a way Socrates could never be. And in 415 BC, Alcibiades convinced the Athenian assembly to vote for a massive military expedition, an invasion of Sicily. This wasn't a small raid. This was a 3-year campaign designed to expand Athenian power. It would cost thousands of lives and nearly bankrupt the city. Alcibiades was supposed to lead it. The night before the fleet sailed, something happened. According to the historical record, Alcibiades and some companions were accused of mutilating statues of Hermes. The god's head was smashed, his phallus broken. This was religious sacrilege. In a city that took its gods seriously, this was the kind of act that brought divine punishment. Alcibiades was recalled from Sicily to stand trial. He fled instead. He defected to Sparta, Athens' mortal enemy, and gave the Spartans military advice. Then he moved to Persia and played Persian politics. Eventually, he returned to Athens, was briefly recalled as a general, then was exiled again. Multiple betrayals, multiple reversals. A man who had played all the sides and served himself exclusively. But here's the crucial connection. Alcibiades was known to be a student of Socrates. When Alcibiades betrayed Athens, part of the blame fell on his teacher. Did Socrates corrupt him? Did Socratic philosophy, all this questioning of laws and customs, make Alcibiades think he was above the rules? The accusation itself was irrational. There's no evidence that Socrates taught Alcibiades to betray the city, but in 399 BC, that didn't matter. The association was enough. Now add Critias. Critias was another brilliant young man. He studied philosophy. He was part of Socrates' circle, and he was also related to Plato, Plato's cousin or uncle, depending on which ancient source you read. Critias was deeply impressed by Socratic philosophy. Plato wrote dialogues featuring Critias and Socrates discussing justice, morality, the nature of truth. But Critias was also an oligarch. When Sparta took over Athens in 404 BC and installed the 30, Critias became the most powerful one, and he was ruthless. Xenophon records that Theramenes, a moderate member of the council, began to object to the executions. Critias didn't argue with him. He ordered Theramenes arrested. He forced him to drink hemlock. Theramenes was dead, and no one could stop it. This is what a student of Socrates became, a mass murderer. By the time democracy returned in 403 BC, Critias was dead, killed in the fighting against Thrasybulus' democratic forces, but his name lived on in infamy, and his education under Socrates lived on as evidence of corruption. In Xenophon's Memorabilia, written years after the trial, he even records a confrontation between Socrates and the 30. According to this account, the 30 summoned Socrates and ordered him not to teach young men anymore. Socrates supposedly responded with sarcasm, "What about if I want to ask someone in the marketplace how much something costs? Am I not allowed to speak?" It's a clever bit of rhetoric. It makes Socrates look noble, defying tyranny. But the underlying fact is, Socrates had relationships with the people running the oligarchy. He hadn't fled. He wasn't in open opposition. A myth that we need to correct right here. Socrates did not lead an anti-democratic conspiracy. That's what his enemies wanted to make it sound like. But the reality is more subtle and more damning. Socrates simply existed in a city where his most famous students had become either traitors or tyrants. And in a fragile, recovering democracy, that existence was dangerous. If Socrates didn't corrupt his students into villainy, why was he associated with such dangerous men? And more troubling, was Socrates himself sympathetic to oligarchy? This chapter answers, why was the real charge against Socrates masked by religious accusations? Let's look closely at what Miletus actually accused Socrates of. The formal charges were two, impiety and corruption of youth. The impiety charge was specific. Socrates, Miletus claimed, did not acknowledge the gods that the city acknowledged. Instead, he believed in daimonies, divine things or spiritual beings. This was heresy. This was introducing new gods. There's something strange about this charge. In Plato's Apology, his account of Socrates' defense, Socrates makes a logical argument. How can I not believe in gods, but still believe in the daemons? If I'm an atheist, as you claim, why would I believe in divine things at all? The contradiction is glaring. Now, Socrates did claim to have a divine sign, a daimonion, an inner voice that warned him away from wrong actions. He said it had been with him since childhood. It never told him to do anything. It only prevented him from doing bad things. When the voice was silent, as it was about his trial, Socrates interpreted that silence as approval. This daimonion is real to him. It's not a metaphor. He genuinely believes he hears a divine signal. And his accusers used it against him. He's introducing new forms of the divine that Athens doesn't recognize. That's religious innovation. That's dangerous. But here's where the evidence gets interesting. Aristophanes, writing in his comedy The Clouds in 423 BC, produced 24 years before the trial, portrays Socrates as an atheist. The character Socrates in the play studies the clouds and air, not gods. He's interested in natural philosophy, not piety. This is a parody, obviously, and most scholars don't take Aristophanes as literal reportage. He was making fun of Socrates for comic effect. But what it tells us is this. By the 420s BC, Socrates had a reputation for being skeptical about traditional religion, for questioning conventional piety, for being interested in natural explanations for things that others attributed to gods. So was Socrates an atheist or agnostic? probably something like agnostic. He believed in the gods. He says so explicitly in the Apology. But he didn't accept the traditional understanding of the gods. He thought they were just and wise, not the jealous, petty creatures of myth. He thought philosophy and the pursuit of knowledge was the truest form of worshiping the gods. And in a city that had just suffered 2 decades of war, a failed military expedition, oligarchic terror, and internal civil conflict, this kind of rational theology was threatening. Because if the gods aren't what we thought, if the old ways don't work, if everything is open to question, what holds the city together? The second charge, corruption of youth, is even more complex. In Plato's Apology, Socrates defends himself against the accusation by saying he never intentionally corrupted anyone. Moreover, he argues, even if he did corrupt someone, it would be stupid of him to corrupt people he might later encounter and be harmed by. The logic is, why would I intentionally create enemies? But it's a defense that misses the actual anxiety. What Socrates did, what he provably did, was gather young men around him and question everything. He'd go to the marketplace, find someone with a reputation for wisdom, a politician, a priest, a poet, and he'd start asking them questions. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? And through a series of Socratic questioning, he'd show that these supposedly wise people didn't actually understand what they were talking about. To the young men watching, this was exciting. A teacher who doesn't pretend to know all the answers, a method that makes you think for yourself. Philosophy is a kind of intellectual game that reveals truth. To the fathers of those young men, and to the politicians being publicly questioned, this was dangerous. These youths were being taught to doubt their elders, to question the laws, to think that understanding virtue through dialogue was more important than respecting tradition and obedience. In the decades leading up to the trial, multiple young men associated with Socrates had become oligarchs, Critias, others. And now, in 399 BC, Athens is paranoid about anti-democratic plots. The amnesty of 400 to 3 BC was supposed to heal the wounds on as between democratic and oligarchic factions, but it clearly hadn't. Trust was fragile. And Socrates, still teaching, still questioning, still attracting youth, was seen as a vector for anti-democratic sentiment. Here's the key insight. Many historians argue that the charge of impiety was real, but it wasn't the whole story. Robin Waterfield, a classical historian who has written extensively about the trial, argues that the political motivation was at least as important as the religious one. In a fragile democracy, Socrates was a liability, not because of what he provably did, but because of what his teaching could lead to, and because of whom he'd taught. But if Socrates was a political threat, why not just exile him? Why death? What was Athens so afraid of that it needed him dead? This chapter answers, what did Socrates' trial reveal about democracy itself? Here's a fact that might surprise you. 399 BC wasn't the only year Athens prosecuted people for impiety. It was a year of trials. Multiple prominent Athenians found themselves in court on similar charges. The timing is almost certainly not a coincidence. What was happening? Why this sudden wave of religious prosecutions? To understand it, you have to understand Athens in 399 BC as a traumatized city, not visibly. The buildings are still standing. The democratic processes are still functioning. But psychologically, Athens is fragile. The Peloponnesian War had lasted nearly 30 years. It had killed tens of thousands of young men. The final siege of Athens had been devastating, and when Sparta installed the 30, it revealed something terrifying. There were Athenians, citizens, leaders, military men, willing to support tyranny, willing to execute their own neighbors, willing to betray everything Athens claimed to stand for. And then the oligarchy was overthrown. Democracy returned. An amnesty was declared, and everyone was supposed to just move on. But moving on from something like that is impossible. The wounds were fresh, the paranoia was real. Every few years, there seemed to be another anti-democratic plot. In the years just before Socrates' trial, persistent fears of oligarchic plots and instability still haunted Athens. Democracy in Athens felt like it was under siege from within. In this context, Socrates becomes dangerous, not because of what he provably taught, but because of what his teaching might encourage. In Plato's Apology, Socrates makes statements that would have made the jury deeply uncomfortable. He says that a just man cannot participate in democratic politics without being killed. He criticizes the democratic processes of Athens. He suggests that wisdom should be valued more than democracy values it. He's not being subtle about his skepticism toward the system that put him on trial, and the jury would have understood this as confirmation. Here is a man who questions democracy. Here is a man whose students have become oligarchs or traitors. Here is a man still teaching young people to think for themselves in ways that challenge the foundations of the state. This is the actual betrayal that Athens felt, the betrayal of having a teacher in their midst who didn't seem to believe in them. It's not that Socrates organized a conspiracy. He didn't, but in teaching people to question everything, to examine assumptions, to trust reason over tradition, he was doing something that oligarchs found attractive and Democrats found threatening. Because democracy, as the Athenians practiced it, was built on the ability of ordinary citizens to make collective decisions. It wasn't built on the idea that they should question everything and trust only those few wise people who had done real philosophy. By prosecuting Socrates, Athens was saying, we can't afford this kind of questioning. We can't afford teachers who make our young people think that democracy is just one opinion among many. We need unity. We need loyalty. We need certainty. And that's the dark side of democracy that Socrates forced into the light. But Socrates didn't fight this verdict. He accepted it. He refused to escape. Why? What made him choose death over exile? This chapter answers, why did Socrates choose death when he could have chosen freedom? The scene in the prison is described in intimate detail by Plato in the Crito. Socrates' friend Crito arrives with a plan. Money has changed hands. Guards have been paid off. There's a boat waiting. Safe houses are arranged. Socrates can be gone before dawn. And Socrates refuses. Crito is bewildered. His friend's life is in danger. The sentence is unjust. Surely escaping an unjust sentence is justified? Socrates himself has claimed to fear injustice more than death. So doesn't it make sense to flee? Socrates' response is philosophical and deeply personal. He tells Crito to imagine that he's having a conversation with the laws of Athens themselves, personified, speaking to him. What would they say? They would remind him that he's lived under their protection his whole life. He was born under them. He was educated under them. He's benefited from their stability and order. To flee would be a betrayal of them. It would be saying that he respects the laws only when they benefit him, only when they're convenient. That's not justice, Socrates argues. That's cowardice disguised as principle. This is important. Socrates is accepting an unjust verdict out of respect for the rule of law itself. He's not saying the trial was fair. He's not saying the verdict was right. He's saying that the system of laws is more important than any one person's life, even his own. It's a breathtaking act of principle, and it's also deeply troubling. Because Socrates is essentially saying, I would rather die than break my bond with a democratic system that's just executed me for political reasons. I would rather die than live outside the laws I've always obeyed. This is the kind of loyalty that gets systems to persist, even unjust ones, even fragile ones. Socrates is willing to stake his life on the principle that the laws matter more than any individual survival, that once you're part of a system, you belong to it completely. It's hard not to see this as a kind of self-betrayal. Socrates betrays his own claim that he fears injustice more than anything, because he chooses to accept an injustice rather than break faith with the system that perpetrated it. Or, and this is the other reading, Socrates is showing a kind of moral courage that democracy needs. He's saying, I will accept the verdict of the people, even though I believe it's wrong, because the alternative is lawlessness. He's modeling the kind of civic virtue that fragile democracies desperately need. The historical record tells us that between his conviction and his execution, Socrates spent nearly a month in prison. He had time to escape. Friends offered to help. He refused. When the hemlock was brought, a cup of poison, he drank it without hesitation. According to Plato's account in the Phaedo, Socrates' last words were these, Crito, we owe a sacrifice of a rooster to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay that debt. Asclepius was the god of healing. The rooster was a traditional offering when someone recovered from illness. Socrates was suggesting, even as he died, that death was a kind of healing, a recovery from the disease of mortal life. It's a way of saying, I'm not afraid. I'm not angry. I'm at peace with this outcome. But let's be clear, this acceptance doesn't validate the trial. It doesn't make the prosecution just. It just makes Socrates willing to pay the price for his philosophy with his life. And maybe that's what changed everything. Because a teacher who dies for his principles is worth far more to history, to philosophy, to memory, than a teacher who runs away. Socrates is dead. His accusers are mostly forgotten. His students carried on his legacy. But what did his death actually prove? Let's step back and see the trial clearly. In 399 BC, Athens prosecuted Socrates on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. These charges were real. Socrates did question traditional religion, and he did attract young men to his philosophical methods, but they were not the whole story. Historians debate the extent to which the trial was fundamentally political. Socrates represented a way of thinking that oligarchs found attractive and Democrats found threatening. His most famous students had become either traitors, Alcibiades, or tyrants, Critias. In a democracy still reeling from oligarchic terror, Socrates was guilt by association and philosophical affinity. He was convicted by a jury of 501 Athenian citizens. 280 voted to condemn him. It was close, but not close enough. The sentence was death. And Socrates accepted it. He refused to escape, refused to beg for mercy, and drank the hemlock when ordered to do so. This act of acceptance, this refusal to compromise, to flee, to submit to desperation, became his greatest teaching, not what he said, but what he did. But now we have to ask, what does it mean that Socrates was willing to die for principle, but not willing to live outside the system that executed him? If we're honest, we have to say that the betrayals in this story are mutual and complicated. Socrates was betrayed by his students' choices. Alcibiades and Critias used what they learned from him to pursue power, not wisdom. They betrayed the philosophical path for political ambition. Athens was betrayed by Socrates' willingness to keep teaching in a city where the oligarchic faction had found his methods attractive. He didn't do anything wrong, but he did nothing to distance himself from dangerous associations either. Socrates betrayed himself, or so it seems, by refusing to save his own life when the opportunity was presented, by choosing principle over survival, by deciding that loyalty to an unjust system was more important than his own existence. And Athens betrayed Socrates by executing him for thought crimes rather than actual crimes, by using religious charges to mask political persecution, by choosing security over the freedom to question. The truth is, all of these are true. The trial wasn't simply an injustice inflicted on an innocent man. It was a moment where a democratic system, in its fragility, tried to eliminate what it perceived as a threat to its stability. But here's what happened next. Socrates' accusers are mostly forgotten. Meletus, the poet who brought the charges, disappears from history. Anytus, one of the other accusers, is remembered only as the man who prosecuted Socrates. Socrates, by contrast, became one of the most influential philosophers who ever lived. His student Plato founded the Academy, which lasted for nearly 900 years. Through Plato's dialogues, Socratic philosophy shaped Western thought, not just philosophy, but everything. Science, education, democracy, law. The method of questioning everything, of examining assumptions, of distrusting received wisdom. This became the foundation of Western intellectual life. So in a strange way, Socrates won. By refusing to compromise, by accepting the death sentence, by maintaining his principles to the very end, he made himself immortal. He made his way of thinking irresistible to future generations. But it's a complicated victory, because Athens' fear wasn't entirely irrational. Socratic philosophy did challenge the stability of democratic systems, the assumption that everything should be questioned, everything examined, everything doubted. This can be destabilizing. It can lead to the kind of paralyzing skepticism that makes collective action impossible. Democratic societies need both, the freedom to question and the stability to function. Athens in 399 BC chose stability, it chose unity, and it killed the man who represented freedom of inquiry. 2,000 years later, the West built itself on that very freedom. We made Socrates into a saint of intellectual inquiry. We made the unexamined life a moral failing. We treated him as right and Athens as wrong. Maybe he was right, but it wasn't obvious at the time. So why does this story matter now? Because we're still living with the tension Socrates represents. We still believe in free inquiry and intellectual freedom. We still believe in democracy, and we still struggle to balance them. Socratic questioning is fundamental to how modern science works. It's how medicine advances, by questioning what we thought we knew. It's how democracy is supposed to work, citizens questioning their leaders, holding them accountable, demanding better. But we also live in a moment where that constant questioning can feel exhausting, where people are skeptical of institutions, skeptical of expertise, skeptical of the possibility of shared truth. We don't execute people for impiety anymore, but we do prosecute people for thought crimes. We do punish people for questioning the official narrative, and we ask, is this intellectual freedom or is this chaos? Socrates couldn't answer that question. He just lived it. He asked questions until it killed him. And then he became, through his death, more influential than if he'd lived 100 years in exile. The trial of Socrates shows us what's at stake when we ask hard questions. It shows us the price of intellectual honesty. And it shows us that sometimes the most radical act is to refuse to compromise, even when the price is everything. Let's recap what we've learned today. In 399 BC, Athens tried and executed Socrates on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. Historians debate the extent to which the trial was motivated by political concerns, but most agree it involved more than the stated religious charges. Socrates represented a way of thinking that threatened a fragile democracy. His students had become oligarchs or traitors. He had questioned everything, and in a city reeling from internal betrayal that was too dangerous to allow. Socrates was convicted by a jury of 501 citizens. He refused to escape. He drank the hemlock poison and died with his principles intact. But by dying, he ensured his immortality. His method, Socratic questioning, became the foundation of Western philosophy, science, and democratic inquiry. The betrayals were mutual. Socrates was betrayed by his students' ambitions. Athens was betrayed by his unwillingness to stop teaching. Socrates betrayed himself by accepting an unjust verdict, and Athens betrayed its ideals by executing the man who embodied them. In the end, Socrates won, but the cost was his life, and the victory was incomplete. That's the trial of Socrates, a trial about more than one man. It's about the eternal tension between freedom and security, questioning and stability, the individual and the state. You were listening to Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened. If you found this episode compelling, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other listeners find us. You can follow us on social media and find there more compelling stories, songs, images, and videos. Next time, we're investigating the story of Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia, Lion of Judah, depositioned, imprisoned, and murdered by his own military. Thank you for joining us in our journey, and until the next episode,